The Inside Story is a podcast that dives deep into the world of whistleblowing, uncovering the untold tales from behind closed doors. Join us as we explore the challenges and impacts of speaking out to stop harm. Jonathan Taylor is a whistleblower that alerted the authorities to large-scale systemic corruption in the oil industry. His disclosures about SBM Offshore led to criminal prosecutions and multi-million-dollar fines being levied in 4 different countries. In October 2022, Jonathan Taylor welcomed the ruling of the Monaco Appeal Court, which, in his words, will give him back control over his life. The extradition attempt marked the end of Taylor's career as a lawyer in the oil and gas industry, wrecked his marriage, and cost him a year of his life. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jonathan. Very much looking forward to having this conversation with you. My first question to you is, what is your whistleblowing story? Can you walk us through it?
I came across information which suggested my former employer had been bribing to win contracts in the offshore oil and gas industry. So I'd been with the company for about 8 years, had no reason to believe that was the case. Then through a combination of phone calls from an external lawyer, the sluice gates opened, and those that were on the outside and had no idea soon became aware. And so that which I found out in the few remaining months I was at the company, SBM Offshore, it's in the oil and gas service industry, around $250 million had been paid in bribes in 5 years alone, up until 2011. Once the rat was out of the bag, there were a lot of very nervous senior management personnel, frankly, running around like headless chickens. The point being is that this was top-down corruption. It was in the fabric of the company. It wasn't just 1 or 2 salesmen doing their own thing. This was based on contracts signed by senior management, often the CEO himself. And the company soon decided it wanted to limit the amount it told the authorities. So now legal involved. I was a lawyer with SBM, and we had hired an external law firm to help investigate what we were beginning to find out. And a policy was soon arrived at of containment. And what the company was aiming to do was to limit as much as possible that which it told the authorities, and also which authorities it would go to. And so it was initially trying to limit it to the bribes that had been exposed in Equatorial Guinea, which represented way less than sort of 6 or 7% of this 250 million. The main bribes, of course, were in Brazil and Angola. Ultimately, my position was made impossible because now I was on the inside, as it were. I knew all this information, and if I wasn't careful, I'd start being associated with this attempt at cover-up and telling select authorities only a part of the picture. And this ultimately ended when a newly appointed chief governance and compliance officer, someone called Sietze Hepkemer, straight in from Allen & Overy, decided that there was no future for me in the company, which I pretty much decided myself, of course. And I left about sort of 4 or 5 months after this exposure. Ultimately, I could see the company, just through its press releases, were again overtly seeking to limit the information it gave out, and pretending there was nothing going on elsewhere outside of Africa, and it was becoming more overt and obvious that it was getting away with corporate murder, if you like, in these bribes and making these bribes. So ultimately, some while after I left the company, having already tipped off the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, who determined they didn't have jurisdiction, I ultimately ended up traveling the world, helping various prosecutors from the Netherlands, from the UK, Switzerland, Brazil, the United States. And over a period of time, a total of, I think the current figure is $843 million was levied in fines against SBM. The most recent former CEO was imprisoned for 3 years. The chap before him got a suspended sentence and fined $500,000 and other imprisonments of certain salesmen. So from a whistleblowing perspective, it's probably fair to say that I was quite successful. I was certainly wrung out of information, which I didn't mind. I was passing all this information on, and I didn't mind that. That was the purpose of what I set out to do. It's really important to understand the consequences of, in this case, the payment of bribes. So, two good examples is by paying hundreds of millions to kleptocrats. So these are typically individuals working in national oil and gas companies. That money is being diverted from where it should be going to the state and basic, investments in infrastructure, things like hospitals and schools and roads and that sort of things, where it's keeping people, bribes are actually keeping people under the poverty line in a country typical of is Angola and Brazil. Furthermore, SBM are also paying amounts to a political party, the Workers' Party in Brazil, the sum of $300,000 illicitly, to try and garner favour with the at the time the first presidential election with someone called Dilma Rousseff, and therefore it was also undermining democracy in what is the fourth largest democracy in the world. So it's important to not just look at bribes in the sort of the payments to procure contracts, but also wider than that, and the effects the payments of bribes can have, and the very negative effect at that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's certainly a very, very inspiring one. And you've shed light on some really, really damning stories within your industry. So if you had to sort of pick out the biggest challenges you faced in coming forwards, what would those be?
So now I was persona non grata in Monaco. So that's where SBM had its main office. It still is the biggest private sector employer there, and obviously persona non grata within the management of SBM for breaching the confidentiality provisions or non-disclosure agreements provisions upon my leaving. And so first of all, I faced what is known as a SLAP, strategic lawsuit against public participation, where I was sued by SBM in Rotterdam for making what it claimed were 3 false statements regarding the payment of those $250 million, the fact that the company was trying to cover up the extent of its corrupt activities, and also in so doing was not being forthright and straight with the markets. All of those statements were actually true. Fortunately, I found a very good lawyer, Otto Vogenant, of Burks Advocaat in Amsterdam, who agreed a very good rate, and he was able to defend me, put in an excellent defense with 127 exhibits, and hey presto, the matter went away. There's a rather odd legal tool in the Dutch legal world called a nihil, and that means a plaintiff can reduce its claim at any given time to 0, and in so doing, the court basically dismisses the case. So I never really got my day in court, which was unfortunate. In the meantime, before they served the writ on me, they got a freezing order on my house and my bank account. And so occasionally you hear people trying to defend SLAPs or defend the ability of companies of large pockets to be able to take such proceedings against individuals, being in the interests of what may or may not be a good case, and the court could find out. But when your bank account in itself is frozen, you can't pay to defend yourself. That puts another light on that. So the slap was defeated, but it of course it had that freezing effect on me, and it was very tough. Fortunately, for only a few weeks, wondering how on earth I was going to get through this, how I was going to afford to defend myself. They wanted me to pay 600,000 euros and then sign a statement which would then be published internationally and on their website and various newspapers, saying I was wrong and what I'd said wasn't true, and the court had ordered that I'd pay compensation, that sort of thing. That fortunately went away. Just as things were getting on an even keel again, I was arrested under an Interpol red notice in Croatia, where I was going on a family holiday on the 30th of July 2020. It seems as though SBM had reported me back in 2014, would you believe, for attempted extortion, just frivolous and vexatious claim, anything to get me, anything to try and ruin me. And Monaco ultimately went ahead and contacted Interpol. Interpol, wrongly, they should have looked into the facts. There was no trial awaiting me. There was no sentence. Normally, one or other of those things that normally need to be in situ for a red notice to be issued. And they're most commonly issued against mass murderers and war criminals and drugs barons and paedophiles and whatnot, not whistleblowers. But unfortunately, it left me in Croatia for 50 weeks. I had spent 5 days in jail, and then was on bail. I had to visit the local police station twice a week and pay some bail. Ultimately, even though Interpol withdrew the red notice in December 2020, the damage was done. I was now in the Croatian legal system. Ultimately, the Court of Appeal, on the third time of asking, determined that I should be extradited. And fortunately, the Justice Minister, Ivan Malenica of Croatia, overruled that decision, and I was allowed to leave and left on the 17th of July 2021. In the meantime, my career is in tatters, as was my marriage, and I just lost a year of my life. So it's been a high price to pay.
That sounds like an incredibly stressful and difficult situation, not just on a practical and financial level, but on a personal level too. And certainly is a good example of the sort of impacts of blowing the whistle on whistleblowers. If there was one measure, policy, or even attitude that would have made blowing the whistle easier for you, what would that have been?
So obviously, from what I've said, clearly protection. So as I said, I was wrong for all the knowledge I had, which I was again perfectly happy to be. But then I was put out to dry. So all those prosecutors that I mentioned earlier, in all those countries, just stood by and did nothing when I was arrested. For bribery and corruption, by the way. That was the box that was ticked on the Interpol sheets, explaining the basis upon which I'd been arrested. I had been actively helping the serious fraud office in London at the time of my arrest, as I had been before on the case called Unaoil, and also helping to confiscate certain of SBM's Brazilians agents' property in London. But once I was arrested, I was left alone and felt totally isolated. Indeed, the government's official position was they needed to be proved that there was a link between my arrest at Dubrovnik Airport and my being a whistleblower. Fortunately, thanks to the support group, of which Protect played a major part, my case was debated under an emergency question in the November 2020 in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. 22 cross-party MPs adroitly in support of me. That was on the Monday, and by the Friday, the government had changed its policy, its view on me, and determined that Croatia and Monaco should treat me like a whistleblower. I'm not sure what difference that ultimately made, but probably the publicity helped and upped the pressure. But generally in life, it's not right that whistleblowers should receive, as I said, slaps. It's not right that whistleblowers should be on the wrong end of a red notice. It's not right that the British Embassy in this case in Zagreb did little or nothing of substance to help me. Whistleblowers desperately require protection. Lawmakers the world over need to be more aware of stories like mine to be able to legislate accordingly. So a law protecting me and protecting a potential whistleblower who'd run a mile if they knew my story, given what happened to me, against slaps, against summary arrests in foreign countries, for example. That's the sort of protection whistleblowers require, and prosecutors actually being prepared to speak to each other and, where necessary, help whistleblowers who find themselves in a position that I did. Whistleblowers require protection. The world is not yet ready.
And finally, what is your message to individuals who find themselves in a similar position to you, witness wrongdoing in their workplace, and think they want to speak out about it?
To think long and hard about unforeseen consequences of doing so. If they do alert the authorities, ensure that they do so with the guarantee of anonymity. That single piece of advice above all was probably the most important, and obviously wasn't the case with me, but to do so, to blow the whistle anonymously through third parties who can then go in and investigate. Where I worked, as I said, the fabric of the company was corruption. That's how the payments of bribes was how it determined its business model. And you will find that often there aren't places within the company that you can blow the whistle to, and if you do, they're ultimately not at the surface. They're backed up by lawyers who just want to protect the company and can't necessarily be trusted. To be very wary of who you blow the whistle to, and preferably third parties, and seek anonymity.
Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's been a pleasure.
You're very welcome. Anytime.